In the final months of the Second World War, Europe trembled under the sound of collapsing empires and advancing armies. Cities lay in ruins, their streets littered with ash, steel, and silence. Yet beneath this chaos, another war was unfolding, hidden from public sight and veiled under the weight of secrecy. Trains departed under cover of darkness. Their cargo not soldiers, but secrets. Gold, art, documents, and technology, stripped from conquered nations and marked for disappearance. Men in leather coats carried files stamped with black eagles, their orders sealed by Führer's decree, their work erased from history by dynamite and silence. In dusty Soviet vaults, half-burned telegrams reference-coded projects. Rees, Molnia, paperclip, the fragments of a truth too dangerous to surface in peacetime. What remains are whispers buried in archives, shredded documents rescued from fire, and testimonies sealed for 50 years under official secrecy acts. Governments denied them, historians dismissed them, but the files still breathe in the margins of war. They reveal a Europe where alliances shifted like shadows, where survival justified every betrayal, and where power was bought not only with blood, but with silence. This is not the war recorded in textbooks or parades, but the war that lived in locked rooms, whispered in corridors, and buried beneath mountains. A war of lost trains, secret pacts, forbidden weapons, and stolen minds. Stories governments tried to erase, but history refuses to forget. What follows are the files that escaped destruction, the suppressed chapters of World War II. Chapter 1: The Nazi Gold Train Conspiracy. In the winter of 1945, as the Third Reich staggered toward collapse, a shadow operation unfolded in the Sudeten mountains of Lower Silesia. Soviet artillery thundered in the east, and the advancing Red Army closed the circle around Breslau. But deep beneath the frozen ridges, men in SS black uniforms worked with a silence that was more telling than words. Their mission was not to repel invaders or reinforce front lines. Their orders, recorded in Gestapo File No. 521, were to vanish wealth, technology, and archives that could never be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Witnesses later described an armored train, its cars sealed with iron doors and bearing the insignia of the Reichsbank, disappearing into a freshly blasted tunnel near Leipzig. What it carried would become one of the most enduring enigmas of the war, the so-called Nazi Gold Train. The details are chilling. Declassified post-war testimonies reference crates marked with swastikas and black eagles, each bearing codes linked to looted art inventories from occupied Poland, Belgium, and France. There were reports of heavy safes loaded with currency and bullion stripped from central banks, and perhaps most disturbingly, sealed containers rumored to hold files on intelligence networks, including the identities of Nazi collaborators in Allied nations. The tunnel itself, allegedly reinforced with concrete by engineering units attached to Organization Todt, was blasted shut on Hitler's direct orders in the final weeks before his death. Those who worked on the site, engineers, guards, and forced laborers, either vanished without a trace or were later found executed, their bodies discarded in shallow graves to ensure silence. When Soviet forces swept into the region in May 1945, records indicate that General Ivan Kurochkin's 62nd Army reported unusual rail activity near Leipzig in the final days of April. Soviet archives reveal that reconnaissance scouts were sent to survey the tunnel system tied to Operation Rees, the sprawling underground project originally intended for armament production and Führer headquarters. Yet, official reports released decades later are conspicuously vague, merely noting that fortifications were neutralized. What they discovered, or chose not to reveal, remains a blank space in history. By 1946, Polish miners working under Soviet supervision reported entering partially collapsed shafts filled with rubble and twisted rails, but their accounts were suppressed, and some of these miners disappeared during subsequent cave-ins, fueling speculation that deliberate silencing was underway. The Allies knew something as well. An OSS cable from July 1945, declassified in the 1990s, references an armored transport of valuables diverted south of Breslau, sealed within mountain infrastructure, presumed recovered by Red Army. Yet curiously, the matter was dropped in official channels. The cable ends with the directive: no further pursuit. Subject closed. Why would the United States, desperate for leverage against the Soviets in the emerging Cold War, abandon such a lead? Historians suspect a clandestine bargain. The US may have traded silence for access to German scientists, intelligence files, or other assets Stalin sought to conceal. The legend of the gold train resurfaced again in the 1950s, when West German intelligence under Reinhard Gehlen received reports from displaced persons claiming to have seen SS convoys guarding rail shipments in Silesia. These accounts were filed, marked unverified, and buried within Bundesnachrichtendienst archives. Yet they aligned uncannily with Polish police reports of locals scavenging Nazi bunkers and stumbling upon strange caches. Art wrapped in Wehrmacht blankets, empty bullion crates, even fragments of documents referencing Transport 42. Each discovery was confiscated by state authorities and never seen again. The physical evidence, what little survived, is fragmented. A rusted length of armoured railcar plating recovered in 1961 near Leipzig matched wartime German specifications for Panzerzug 88, a specialised armoured train unit documented in Wehrmacht transport logs until March 1945, when records abruptly cease. A fragment of charred manifest paper found nearby bore the partially legible stamp of the Reichsbank Breslau branch. Though these pieces suggest movement of high-value cargo, the full picture remains concealed by missing files, destroyed tunnels, and official silence. Why was this train so important? Theories abound. Some argue it carried merely gold and stolen art, intended as financial lifeboats for fleeing Nazi elites. Others suggest a darker cargo, chemical or biological research, perhaps connected to secret projects under SS General Hans Kammler, who oversaw both V-2 rocket production and underground facilities. Still others point to intelligence dossiers, lists of collaborators, industrial partners, and covert negotiations with neutral states that could have destabilized post-war governments if revealed. The truth may lie in a combination of all three, locked away in whatever was sealed behind those stone walls. The Polish People's Republic, under Soviet control, treated the matter with deliberate amnesia. Official histories dismissed the gold train as bourgeois propaganda, even as military patrols cordoned off suspected tunnels for decades. When independent researchers attempted to investigate in the 1970s, they faced harassment, confiscated equipment, and charges of disturbing state property. NATO intelligence from the same era noted Warsaw Pact troop movements in the Al Mountains, far from any strategic necessity, suggesting the Soviets still guarded something hidden there. In modern times, the story refuses to die. In 2015, two treasure hunters using ground-penetrating radar announced they had located a massive metal structure buried beneath rail lines near Leipzig. The Polish government swiftly intervened, sealing the site under the jurisdiction of the military and denying further excavation. Official statements declared no evidence of a train, yet eyewitnesses claimed to see unusual convoys removing soil samples at night. The episode mirrored the old pattern: discovery, silence, and denial. The Nazi gold train conspiracy is not just a tale of treasure. It represents the collision of power, secrecy, and the rewriting of history. If the train was indeed discovered by Soviet forces, then its cargo, whatever it contained, became a weapon in Stalin's post-war strategy. If the Allies knew and allowed the matter to vanish, then it was buried not only in stone, but in diplomacy. The silence surrounding it, the missing files, the erased testimonies, all point to one reality. Governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain wanted the world to forget, and yet the mountains remember. Beneath Leipzig, shafts lie collapsed, tunnels remain uncharted, and stories persist among locals of sealed passages, where the earth hums unnaturally, as if metal still waits behind stone. The Nazi gold train is more than a legend. It is a wound in history, a secret transported under fire, entombed in the ground, and smothered by the politics of victory. Whether it was gold, weapons, or knowledge, the train's true cargo was never meant for the world to see. It was meant to vanish into silence, leaving only whispers in declassified margins, and the chilling certainty that some parts of World War II remained deliberately unfinished. Chapter 2: Stalin's Secret Pact for Berlin. In March 1945, Berlin was a city teetering on the edge of annihilation. Its avenues were littered with rubble, its skies scarred with black smoke from relentless Allied bombardments, and its people starving within the confines of a doomed Reich. Yet, Behind the crumbling facades and shattered streets, a quieter war of whispers and back-channel meetings unfolded. A war recorded in fragments of declassified Soviet communications and long-buried intelligence notes. These documents, marked with the codename Agreement Molnia, suggest that Joseph Stalin himself sanctioned a secret pact with elements of the Nazi regime, not for peace, but for advantage. What the records imply is chilling, that Stalin permitted select SS officers and remnants of Hitler's elite to slip westward in exchange for military intelligence that would give the Soviet Union a stranglehold over the post-war balance of power. NKVD memoranda, recovered from Moscow's Central Archive in the late 1990s, reference covert approaches by SS emissaries through neutral Swedish channels. According to one decrypted telegram dated March 12, 1945, Soviet intermediaries received proposals of military intelligence transfer in return for conditional safe passage. These transfers included technical specifications for the V-2 rocket guidance systems developed under SS General Hans Kammler, and, even more dangerously, lists of suspected British intelligence informants embedded within the Reich. Stalin, ever the strategist, understood the value of such knowledge. While his armies marched westward, he was already maneuvering for dominance in the world that would follow the Reich's fall. Western records corroborate the shadows of these dealings. Declassified OSS files note unaccountable safe passages of SS convoys moving west through collapsing German defenses, seemingly unmolested by Soviet artillery. One chilling entry, marked OSS Cable 447-5, describes an SS column of trucks carrying unknown cargo permitted to exit the Berlin perimeter under Red Army observation in April 1945. No engagement recorded, the report states, before abruptly closing with the directive, "Matter unresolved, source to be sealed." Such deliberate vagueness suggests more than oversight. It suggests complicity, silence agreed upon in smoke-filled rooms thousands of miles from the dying city. But who were these men allowed to slip through the cracks of war? Historians have long debated whether Kammler himself, the man overseeing both the V-2 rocket and the construction of underground armament facilities, was among them. Officially, Kammler vanished in May 1945, with reports ranging from suicide near Prague to execution by SS comrades. Yet CIA files declassified in 2003 contain references to Kammler asset interrogation in Allied custody, though redacted beyond recognition. If Kammler indeed reached Western lines with Soviet approval, his survival would confirm the unholy nature of Agreement Molnia. A bargain struck not for mercy, but for leverage in the world to come. Soviet intentions were never altruistic. Stalin knew Berlin would be the symbolic prize of the war, but he also knew its ruins concealed technological secrets, scientists, and intelligence assets coveted by both East and West. The deal allowed him to gain access to critical rocket data, while avoiding unnecessary attrition against SS units desperate to flee west and surrender to the Americans. The files recovered indicate that Stalin demanded, in return, intelligence on Western networks, informants, industrial backers, and diplomatic channels that the Reich had monitored since 1939. Such intelligence would prove invaluable in shaping the Soviet Union's immediate post-war espionage strategy, particularly during the first volatile years of the Cold War. Why has history remained silent on this? Because exposure would have undermined the very moral framework upon which the Allied victory was constructed. If Stalin had indeed negotiated with the enemy while his armies slaughtered their way into Berlin, it would have revealed a betrayal not only of his soldiers, but of the Allied trust holding together the fragile coalition. Similarly, Western intelligence, aware of these movements, chose not to press the issue. Washington and London needed a stable narrative of total victory, not one stained by secret deals and unanswered questions. Yet fragments persist. A file marked Molnia 17, found in the Soviet archives, speaks of delivery of names from SD, records to facilitate long-term penetration. This appears to reference the Sicherheitsdienst, dossiers on Allied sympathizers, many of whom would later vanish into the fog of Cold War purges. Simultaneously, British Foreign Office records from 1946 contain unexplained notes on the loss of valuable operatives in occupied Europe, identities compromised. Were these casualties of Stalin's secret bargain? The paper trail hints at it, though confirmation remains deliberately elusive. The implications stretch far beyond Berlin. If Stalin knowingly allowed Nazi elites to escape westward, then the carefully constructed narratives of Nuremberg and post-war justice were compromised from the start. It suggests that victory was not simply unconditional surrender, but a tapestry of compromises, exchanges, and silences designed to serve the geopolitical ambitions of the victors. It means that, for all the rhetoric of liberation, the final days of the Reich were less about justice and more about possession, of scientists, of weapons, of secrets, and of power. The image of Berlin's collapse, its smoldering Reichstag, its desperate Volkssturm conscripts, its civilians cowering in cellars, conceals this darker layer of history. Beneath the roar of artillery and the crack of rifles, secret agreements were being written in invisible ink, shaping the world that followed. The Pact, if fully revealed, would show that Stalin's march into Berlin was not only a conquest of stone and blood, but also a chess move in a longer game. A game where the sacrifice of millions was weighed against the survival of secrets. Stalin's secret pact for Berlin remains one of the most unsettling buried chapters of World War II. It challenges the notion of absolute victory, suggesting instead that betrayal and survival walked hand in hand through the ruins of 1945. And while governments continue to deny its existence, the scattered files, the vanished convoys, and the unresolved fates of men like Hans Kammler speak with a voice louder than silence. In the heart of the world's most devastated city, deals were struck in shadows, leaving behind questions that no tribunal would ever answer, and no official history would dare to ask. Chapter 3: Churchill's Hidden Chemical Warfare. Plot. By 1942, Britain stood at a precipice. The Luftwaffe had ravaged London. U-boat wolf packs strangled supply routes across the Atlantic, and Hitler's Wehrmacht stretched from the beaches of France to the steppes of Russia. The United States had entered the war, but the tide was far from turned, and Winston Churchill feared that Britain might not withstand a drawn-out campaign. In this climate of desperation, the War Cabinet sanctioned one of the most disturbing contingency operations of the Second World War. Known by the codename Operation Vegetarian, it was a plan not to strike Germany's armies, but to annihilate its food supply, turning fertile farmland into fields of death. Its weapon was not artillery or bombers, but anthrax, a spore so lethal it could persist in the soil for decades. Declassified documents and trial records reveal how close this plan came to reality, and how its shadow lingered long after the war's end. The core of Operation Vegetarian lay in a deceptively simple delivery system. Linseed oil cakes, small animal feed supplements that could be easily scattered across pastures and consumed by cattle. To the naked eye, they appeared harmless. In reality, each was designed to carry anthrax spores, cultivated in secret at Britain's Porton Down facility, under the direction of microbiologists working for the Ministry of Supply. Once ingested, the spores would kill livestock within days. Entire herds would collapse, their carcasses burned in futile attempts at containment. The effect would ripple outward. Milk, meat, and agricultural production across Germany would vanish, starving civilians and soldiers alike. Churchill himself, in War Cabinet minutes dated July 1942, acknowledged the potential. "It may well be the only means," he remarked, "to bring Germany to her knees should invasion fail." Trials were conducted under absolute secrecy. Gwynedd Island, a small, windswept landmass off the coast of Scotland, was chosen as the test site. In 1942, military scientists released anthrax spores on grazing sheep to study the weapon's effectiveness. The results were devastating. Within 3 days, every animal was dead, their bodies bloated and blackened. The soil absorbed the spores, creating an invisible minefield of infection. Attempts to disinfect the ground failed. For decades after, the island remained quarantined, marked with warning signs, its very earth lethal to life. The British government officially denied the tests for years, but declassified files in the 1980s confirmed the operation's scale and intent. Gwynedd became a symbol of a weapon so terrible it could not be unleashed, and yet so close to being used. Production was no theoretical exercise. Archival records show that by late 1942, the Ministry of Supply had ordered the manufacture of 5 million anthrax-laced linseed cakes. These were to be stockpiled, and if Britain faced imminent defeat, dropped over German fields by the Royal Air Force. Specially modified bombers would scatter the cakes in waves, ensuring maximum contamination across agricultural regions in Bavaria, Saxony, and Prussia. The planners calculated that within weeks, Food supplies would collapse, famine would spread, and civilian casualties could reach into the millions. Operation Vegetarian was, in essence, a plan for genocide through starvation, masked as military necessity. The moral implications were staggering, but war eroded morality. In the same Porton-Down files, handwritten notes reveal discussions on the feasibility of targeting not only Germany, but also occupied territories supplying the Reich. There are chilling references to secondary benefits if anthrax spread into Poland and Czechoslovakia, disrupting both enemy logistics and resistance movements. Civilian death was accepted as collateral damage, buried beneath euphemisms like strategic denial. Churchill himself, though never publicly linked to the plan during his lifetime, signed off on its continuation until 1944, when Allied advances reduced its necessity. Yet the danger did not end with the war's turning tide. The anthrax stockpiles remained. Porton-Down continued its work under the guise of defensive research, but internal memoranda show concerns that the cakes could not be easily destroyed without risking contamination. Some were incinerated, but others were stored in sealed facilities, monitored through the Cold War. Testimonies from former scientists suggest that fragments of Operation Vegetarian were quietly integrated into NATO's bioweapons programs, despite international treaties banning such research. In the name of security, the legacy of Churchill's hidden plans survived long after its immediate threat had passed. The secrecy surrounding Operation Vegetarian was absolute. Files were locked under the Official Secrets Act, witnesses silenced, and Gruinard's contamination denied. When journalists probed the matter in the 1960s, officials dismissed it as rumor. Only in 1981, when an activist group calling itself the Dark Harvest Commandos stole contaminated soil from Gruinard and deposited it outside a government laboratory, did the truth begin to surface. Public pressure forced the government to acknowledge the contamination, and by 1986, a costly decontamination effort began. It required spraying 280 tons of formaldehyde diluted in seawater across the island and burning the contaminated topsoil. Only then, after more than 4 decades, was Gruinard declared safe. The anthrax had outlived the war, becoming a silent reminder of the weapons Britain had nearly unleashed. What makes this story more sinister is the deliberate erasure. The British government, unlike with atomic weapons, never publicly debated the morality of anthrax deployment. There were no Nuremberg-style trials for planners of biological warfare. Instead, files were sealed, scientists were reassigned, and history was written without mention of famine bombs and poisoned fields. The moral stain was concealed under the banner of victory, leaving only whispers in classified annexes and shadows in the memories of those who had seen the experiments firsthand. For those who study the ethics of war, Operation Vegetarian remains a case study in desperation and silence. Britain, celebrated for its defiance during the Blitz, was prepared to wage total war not just against the Wehrmacht, but against the soil and the stomachs of an entire people. Had the plan been executed, Germany's surrender would have come not with parades in ruined cities, but with the slow collapse of millions into starvation, their deaths stretching far beyond the battlefield. Europe itself might have been rendered uninhabitable for generations, its farmlands poisoned by a microbe that lingers longer than any bomb's radiation. Churchill's hidden chemical warfare plot was never carried out, but its existence is undeniable. The declassified files, the contaminated island, the hidden stockpiles, all stand as evidence of a weapon too terrible to be remembered, yet too real to be dismissed. It is a reminder that victory in war is rarely clean, and that beneath the rhetoric of freedom and justice lie shadows of desperation, secrecy, and decisions too dark to fit into official histories. Operation Vegetarian was a plan to starve a nation into submission, a secret so grave it was meant to die in silence. Yet history has exhumed it, a haunting echo of how close humanity came to turning the soil of Europe into a graveyard of spores and silence. Chapter 4. America's secret Nazi scientist transfers. As the guns of World War II fell silent in May 1945, another battle began. A battle not fought with tanks and infantry, but with dossiers, airplanes, and the quiet shuffling of men whose names were meant to disappear. Operation Paperclip, the codename chosen by the US Office of Strategic Services and later absorbed into the newly created Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, was designed to spirit hundreds of Nazi scientists, engineers, and intelligence operatives out of Germany and into the United States. It was an operation cloaked in deception, files rewritten, war crimes ignored, and histories erased. The men who only weeks earlier had sworn loyalty to Hitler now found themselves repurposed as architects of America's future. The bargain was simple. Their knowledge would buy them protection, while their pasts would be buried in silence. The names that survived into public memory are only the tip of the iceberg. Wernher von Braun, the visionary behind the V-2 rocket program, became the father of NASA's Saturn V and the Apollo program. Yet the V-2 itself was a weapon built on the corpses of thousands of slave laborers in Mittelwerk and Dora concentration camps. Survivors testified at Nuremberg to the brutality of its production. Men hung from cranes for sabotage, corpses left among the machinery as warnings. Von Braun knew, and yet in US custody his record was sanitized. CIA and Army intelligence officers placed paperclips on incriminating files, literally attaching false biographical sheets to replace the originals. Crimes vanished with a single staple, and men who should have stood in the dock at Nuremberg instead boarded planes bound for Fort Bliss, White Sands, and Huntsville. The flights were carried out under absolute secrecy. Military C-47 transport aircraft ferried scientists under cover of night from Europe to American soil. Codenames concealed their identities, and passenger manifests were either destroyed or filed under innocuous headings. In some cases, the men were smuggled through ratline routes originally used by fleeing SS officers, but this time the destination was not Argentina or Spain, but Washington. DC declassified State Department cables reveal friction. Diplomats protested, warning that the admission of known SS members violated Allied resolutions. Yet the Pentagon pressed ahead, arguing that Soviet intelligence was already hunting the same men. In the logic of the emerging Cold War, morality was expendable. The race for supremacy, in rockets, in medicine, in nuclear and biological warfare, overrode the pursuit of justice. The scientists brought more than expertise. They carried documents, prototypes, and in some cases, human data gathered from experiments in camps. A particularly disturbing case is Dr. Hubertus Strughold, later celebrated in America as the father of space medicine. His Nazi-era work included overseeing experiments where prisoners were subjected to freezing conditions and low-pressure chambers, mimicking high-altitude flight. Survivors described agony, deaths recorded with clinical detachment. Yet in US custody, Strughold's record was scrubbed, and he became a key figure in aerospace physiology research. His name graced libraries and awards until belated investigations in the late 20th century exposed the suppressed truth. Operation Paperclip extended beyond rockets and medicine. Intelligence specialists from the Abwehr and SD were absorbed into the fabric of American espionage. Men like Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's former chief of intelligence on the Eastern Front, were not only spared prosecution, but placed in charge of creating the West German intelligence service under CIA supervision. Gehlen's files, which contained invaluable details on Soviet troop movements, became the bargaining chip that bought his survival. He recruited former Gestapo and SS officers into the new agency, embedding Nazi networks into the very foundation of Cold War intelligence. America turned a blind eye because the enemy had shifted. Yesterday's criminals became today's assets. The operation was not without its dissenters. Within the War Department, some officers expressed outrage at the protection of war criminals. A 1947 report from the Justice Department, uncovered decades later, warned that several paperclip recruits were implicated in atrocities. The report was suppressed and its authors marginalized. The prevailing directive from Washington was clear. Do not allow Soviet hands to seize what America could use. The competition with Moscow was absolute, and in that competition, morality was a casualty. The results were undeniable. By the 1950s, paperclip scientists had advanced American rocketry to levels unthinkable in 1945. Von Braun's team at Redstone Arsenal developed ballistic missiles, paving the way for the nuclear-armed Jupiter and Pershing systems. Space medicine research accelerated, feeding into Project Mercury and Gemini. Yet the human cost remained buried. The victims of Mittelwerk, the prisoners frozen in experiments, the nameless dead who paid with their lives for this knowledge, were excised from the narrative. The world was told a sanitized story of genius rescued from ruins, not of crimes transmuted into progress. The secrecy endured for decades, Congressional inquiries in the 1960s and 1970s faced stone walls of classification. Families of camp victims who sought justice were told there was insufficient evidence. When investigative journalists pried open the first files in the 1980s, the revelations caused brief scandal, but were quickly absorbed into the Cold War's broader amnesia. By then, many of the paperclip scientists were retired, honored, or dead. The narrative of American triumph in space had already been written, and its darker origins dismissed as inconvenient truths. Operation Paperclip reveals the uncomfortable intersection of victory and complicity. The United States, champion of democracy and freedom, chose to ally with perpetrators of inhumanity to secure dominance over the Soviet Union. The documents declassified since confirm not just isolated cases, but a systemic policy. Erase the crimes, integrate the criminals, harvest their knowledge. The paperclips that held together falsified files became symbols of a broader deception. History rewritten in silence. The legacy is twofold. On one hand, the rockets that carried astronauts to the moon bore the fingerprints of men once loyal to Hitler. On the other, the moral compromises of paperclip haunt America's historical conscience. It is a reminder that in the corridors of power, the calculus of survival often outweighs justice. The victims of Dora, of Dachau, of nameless laboratories remain unacknowledged in the official triumphs of science. Their suffering was buried beneath launch pads and laboratories, a silence governments tried to preserve. America's secret Nazi scientist transfers were not a footnote, but a cornerstone of post-war power. They demonstrate how easily the line between justice and expediency can be erased, how men once branded enemies can be transformed into assets with the stroke of a pen. Behind the rockets, behind the laboratories, behind the smiling photographs of astronauts, lies a hidden ledger of crimes absorbed and forgotten. It is a story governments tried to destroy, but one that history continues to exhume from the margins of declassified files. As the curtain falls on these suppressed chapters of the Second World War, one truth remains impossible to bury. The victors did not merely inherit the ruins of the Reich, they inherited its secrets. From trains sealed inside mountains to secret bargains in the ashes of Berlin, from anthrax cakes designed to poison the soil of Europe to Nazi scientists absorbed into American laboratories, these stories reveal a war that never truly ended. The battlefields of 1939 to 1945 gave way to darker arenas, underground tunnels, sealed archives, classified intelligence vaults, where silence was as deadly as any weapon. Governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain chose what the public would remember and what would be erased. Justice was partial, morality expendable, and truth locked away in vaults marked top secret. Yet fragments escaped. Burned telegrams half legible, testimonies ignored, files misfiled and rediscovered decades later. They remind us that history is not only what is recorded, but also what is deliberately concealed. The unanswered questions linger. What else lies sealed in archives still unopened? What other weapons or deals have been written out of the official record? And if these forced secrets could survive fire and silence for nearly a century, how many more remain buried, waiting to surface? In the silence of mountains, in the ashes of Berlin, in islands scarred by anthrax, in the foundations of the space race, the past whispers its warnings. Not everything was destroyed in 1945. Some of it was hidden. Some of it still waits.